Welcome to the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies Online. For more information about our programs, publications and membership, please visit our website, themuslimfaculty.org.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salatu wassalamu ala ashraf al-mursaleen, Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Welcome to the Civilization and Society program of the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies. This is the fifth of 12 sessions which make up the Politics of Power module. The entire session will last approximately 1 hour and comprise a lecture of around 40 minutes, followed by a 5-minute interval, and ending with a short question and answer period. You're encouraged to make a written note of any questions that may occur to you for clarification after the lecture. This is the third of 4 consecutive lectures focusing specifically on the matter of the French Revolution. Last week, we aimed to acquaint ourselves with the living atmosphere of the revolutionary drama and some of its outstanding political figures and personalities, principally through the writings of Thomas Carlyle and Ian Dallas. This week, we will endeavour to examine the extent to which the French Revolution has served as a template for the formation of the modern state and its social, political, and economic modalities. I propose that we begin by looking at what it is we mean in this context by modernity. For our present purposes, I will include, along with it, the oft-mentioned concept of so-called post-modernity, as social scientists, historians, and all manner of cultural observers are still debating its validity and possible definitions as something genuinely distinct from the modern. Let it suffice to say, therefore, that as interesting a discussion as it may be, the nature of any distinction or otherwise between the modern and the postmodern is not our particular focus today. However, although we will have good cause further below to make specific reference to postmodernism in the context of the present-day social and psychological effects of the condition of mental dehistoricization, which the historian Professor J. Clark describes as presentism, its relevance for us is that it falls within the extended arc of the post-revolutionary legacy as an important feature of the contemporary condition. In traditional historical terms, modernity has been divided into 3 periods: early, classical, and late. Early modernity covers the period from the fall of Constantinople to the Osmanlis in 1453 to 1789, a very familiar date to us by now, but it is also, remember that this period largely characterized philosophically and politically, as we saw in our second lecture of the module, by the phenomenon of the Enlightenment. The attendant advances in technology in the late 18th century had also begun to usher in the beginnings of industrialization. Classical modernity covers the period 1789 to the end of World War I, which is marked by the effective end of Europe's imperial phase and the beginning of a new balance of power with the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and the growing impact of the American military, economic and political presence on the world stage. Late modernity is taken as covering the period from the end of World War I in 1918 to 1989, which was marked by the beginning of the rapid collapse of the Soviet Union, leaving the USA as the world's dominant cultural, economic, political, and military force. The period from 1989 onwards would certainly fall within the scope of that discussion of postmodernism I referred to earlier, and which for the time being we can treat simply as a continuation of modernity. Modernity may be defined or discussed in a wide range of terms, depending upon whether the main point of focus is upon artistic, cultural, or philosophical trends, or whether the emphasis is upon the socio-economic and political developments. The French Revolution will have had its impact across the board, but as far as being a template for modernity is concerned, we will be largely preoccupied with describing its historical capacity to prefigure and project modern society towards particular forms of capitalism and the nation-state, with its model constituent components and all of the political modalities we have come to associate with the proliferation of representative democracies, liberal in complexion or otherwise, across the world. By looking at the progress of modernization through the lens of the Industrial Revolution, Norman Davies provides us with an impressive list comprising 48 of what he refers to as its component processes. There is no doubt in my mind that all of these factors are relevant and have had their part to play. However, I'm relieved to say that a comprehensive examination of all of the interlocking and overlapping relationships between these multiple elements is certainly not possible in the time we have available to us, and is in fact unnecessary, since in order to recognize the template we are looking for, it is sufficient that we identify the essential supporting elements within the entire complex. In order to colour the picture with certain other key dimensions, we must then superimpose the analytical historical grid supplied by Ian Dallas in the time of the Bedouin. Therefore, without claiming to be definitive, and bearing in mind that each might merit a whole lecture in its own right, I have selected the following 18 essential components from Davies' list, and they are mobility of labour, which includes the enclosures and the emancipation of the serfs, new sources of power, coal, steam, gas, oil, electricity, communications, post, telegraph, telephone, radio, etc., science and technology, there's research and development, urbanization, including town planning and public services and so on. We then have capital investment, joint stock companies, trusts, cartels, etc. A money economy, which includes wages and prices and taxes, paper money. Financial services. Then we have the new social classes. Also, we look at the transformation of family structures, the question of women, consumerism. There's also education, literacy and mass culture, and the social sciences. And then we have the extension of the electorate, elaborate social legislation, and total war. So that's 18 components which I've abstracted or extracted from the Davies' original list of 48. So let me just mention those again. It's mobility of labour, new sources of power, communications, science and technology, urbanization, capital investment, the money economy, financial services, new social classes, transformation of family structures, women, consumerism, education, literacy and mass culture, social sciences, extension of the electorate, elaborate social legislation, and total war. One could possibly simplify the list further still, by arranging them according to categories, which In fact, I've done that in the notes, so when you see those, you'll find that they're colour-coded and very easy to refer to within their categories. So, for obvious reasons, mobility of labour, new sources of power, science and technology and communications, and urbanisation, I've classed together as the core socio-economic factors that drove the progression from feudal and agrarian forms of economic activity to industrialised forms. One might also group into a single category new social classes, transformation of family structures, women and consumerism as the necessary social consequences and required modalities. Thirdly, we can categorize education, literacy and mass culture and the social sciences together as the means and methodology whereby the necessary indoctrination and mental conditioning for modern living are generated and transmitted. The fourth grouping comprises extension of the electorate, elaborate social legislation and total war as expressions of the legalistic character of status control, manipulation and coercion. And the final category, comprising capital investment, the money economy and financial services, here represents the standard picture of the mercantilist and free market operations of capitalism. However, we will see below the extent of the inadequacy of the standard picture when we come to examine the true nature and significance of the operating practices of the banking oligarchies whose monopoly over the generation of paper money, the application of usurious financial instruments, and the manipulation of debt-based transactions on a supranational scale have given them de facto economic and political hegemony over the modern state, and the manner in which the seeds were embedded within the roots of the revolutionary flowering. So now we come to the Dallas grid, which we'll apply to these matters. The time of the Bedouin comes into its own here as an analytical and descriptive narrative of the broad sweep of political, historical and social currents which dives below the open yet hidden underbelly of liberal democracy and the modern state to reveal the largely unspoken elephants in the room of history, without the recognition and acknowledgement of which we are doomed to repeat, or have repeated upon us, the politics of terror and democratic totalitarianism exercised by the machinery of state under the imperatives of the new banking aristocracy, which took its place in the back seat of the original Napoleonic vehicle and has held its position at the front of the 21st century's political economy, having taken on various technological enhancements, but using exactly the same roadmap and following exactly the same route. What follows is a 10-point summary of the salient features of political modernity as bequeathed to us by revolutionary France. 1. A historical claim to philosophical validation going back to the Enlightenment. And Dr. Dallas says, the Enlightenment became the in-back theoretical claim for the new society. A crude scientism gave legitimacy to the new legislated totalitarianism. Of course, as we saw in the second lecture of this module, where we looked at the overall European context, it was the Enlightenment and its claims to the advent of the Age of Reason which put the seal of secularism on the fundamental identity of the modern era. And I've a quote here. Recognizing the aspiration to that change of authority from religion to science is the key to understanding the Enlightenment, informed in its very essence by the idea that the spirit of science should be extended into all domains. That was what the Enlightenment was, an enlargement of the scientific approach. To put it at its most general, the empirically controlled, responsible, non-dogmatic exercise of reason to wider domains of concern. Major examples of its consequences, to speak again in general terms, are all the revolutions of the 18th century. And that was taken from Grayling's Towards the Light. It is a defining characteristic of the secular state that religion, once it is displaced as the authoritative binding factor in society by atheism, or more accurately humanism, to identify it by its political face, is relegated to the realm of the free choice of personal belief or spirituality afforded and protected in the case of liberal democracies, not only by domestic legislation, but by supranationally imposed conventions on human rights, which undoubtedly find strong precedence within the revolutionary template. And Davies says, the concept of human rights, if not invented by the French revolutionaries, was certainly given its strongest modern impetus. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen carried forward constructs contained in England's Bill of Rights of 1689 and the fundamental declarations surrounding the independence of the USA. Battered and bruised, it survived as a lasting monument to the early idealism of the revolution. So that's the first of our 10 points. The second is an abolished monarchy. Eliminated, as in the case of the French Bourbons, by the Revolutionary Declaration of a Republic, or, as in the case of Britain, neatly disempowered by constitutional limitations. Our third defining feature of modernity is the transfer of absolute sovereignty previously enjoyed by the monarch to the parliamentary or representative assembly, at least ostensibly given the very real power being exercised from behind the wings by the financial oligarchy, with a now individualized population exposed as never before to the full brunt of unmediated state powers. And Fauré says, he, referring to Napoleon, was by temperament 1,000 times more authoritarian than the former king, and he governed a society that had become more than ever a society of equal individuals, relatively defenseless against the power of the state. The idea of absolute power remained intact, as potent as ever, the monarchy's legacy to the new democracy. The sovereignty of the people had replaced the sovereignty of the monarch, but sovereignty itself remained unlimited in extent and indivisible by its very nature. And quoting from de Tocqueville in On Democracy in America, the Time of the Bedouin gives us this. They recovered centralization from its ruins and restored it, and at the same time that they raised it up again, all that had formerly limited it remained destroyed, and from the very entrails of a nation that had just overthrown royalty, one was to see suddenly emerge a more extended power, more detailed, more absolute than that which had been exercised by any of our kings. So that's the third defining feature of modernity. Our fourth point is the institution of a democratic apparatus of government whose purpose is to provide for the stable continuity of economic conditions that are permanently amenable to the wealth creation and behind-the-scenes political control mechanisms of the banking and finance elite. This is achieved, firstly, by the maintenance of a monolithic centralized state structure, which to all intents and purposes is coterminous with and indistinguishable from the nation itself. In other words, the general population can no longer perceive of itself, collectively or as individuals, or the nation itself in terms other than those derived directly from within the administrative parameters of the state in question. A key element in this process is the conferment of universal suffrage. This is the basis for the second crucial factor, which is the imposition of peaceful and civilized continuity through a system modelled upon the assemblies of the French Revolution. However, whereas in revolutionary France heads might have rolled on all sides, given the raw and open exercise of the politics of power, in today's iteration, a watered-down parliamentary or congressional show is all that is required as cover for the operations of the anonymous oligarchs of the money power, over whom the politicians have no meaningful jurisdiction whatsoever. On the contrary, until the cracks started to appear in the banking crisis of 2008, the ignorant voting public has been quite unaware that the entire political stage is subordinated to the imperatives of the money markets. The effectiveness of democratic assembly as a veil is based upon the institutionalized establishment of an apparent dialectic of opposition between organized parties of elected members whose legitimacy derives from being the chosen representatives of the most significant political tendencies present within the population. The scenario can be compared to a perpetual merry-go-round, complete with intra-factional feuding, purges and defections, with the levers of government being passed around, or more typically back and forth between two major parties by turns, as the incumbents are electorally overthrown by the opposition by undertaking to fulfill promises contained in manifestos and or repair the damage left by the broken promises and apparent failures of the ruling party. A recent faculty blog describes it as follows. Our daily reality subjects us to dramas of ritualized political combat, such as those between Republicans and Democrats in the US, or between Conservatives and Socialists in the UK, whose obviously choreographed moves, like those of professional wrestlers, do not prevent them from generating the highly charged atmosphere of partisanship amongst the spectators required to sustain the fiction. Point number 5 is the dictatorship by the democratic institution of permanent revolution and inevitable terror. This realization, because of the overtly paradoxical and counterintuitive nature of it, is not instantly discernible. It is too contradictory and surprising a destination for the modern mind trained to the expectation of evolutionary social progress to readily arrive at. However, Dr. Dallas puts it unambiguously. He says, the procedures which gave legality, and indeed were the legality on which terror was founded during the French Revolution, have not in any way been surpassed in more recent democratic political procedure and practices. A constitutional instrument of power is itself a dynamic which can move into special modes, crisis policies, emergency powers, rules of exception. Such powers, far from being rare, are constants of democratic governance, which allows us to say, however illogical it demonstrably is, that totalitarian edict and terror are both built into and necessary for the continuance and survival of the same democratic system. The freedom of democratic governments to legitimately avail themselves of the whole judicial and legislative apparatus, or indeed to legally circumvent it in order to carry out extreme political measures deemed by them to be necessary, amount in effect to a coup d'etat worthy of the original 18th Brumaire precedent set by Napoleon in November 1799, in order to protect and consolidate the gains of the revolution and ensure the survival of the first modern European state. Dallas brings us back to the present day by making direct reference to the ongoing example of the war on terror, initiated in a blizzard of anti-terrorism legislation and special homeland security measures as the imperative response to external threat by Bush's Republican government, which is now being continued under Obama's Democratic administration in a prolonged campaign of military terror, torture, assassinations, and kidnappings across the Muslim world, judicial anomalies such as Guantanamo Bay and the declaration of war against an undetermined abstraction, and the general exercise of almost unlimited new powers of surveillance and coercion on the domestic population at the expense of long-established constitutional freedoms, as we saw inflicted on peaceful, non-violent demonstrators during last year's Occupy Wall Street campaign, and which remain present in airport security regimes. He states, "What is at present taking place is the classical modus operandi of revolution itself. The passivity, even indifference of the mass before the legislation that removes independence to replace it with social safety, the configuration of an exterior enemy, itself wittily named terrorism, the appearance of a leadership that takes over the machinery of state, even with the appearance of being the elected government. All these elements emerging in unison must be inescapably the event called revolution." And even more ominously, it is the fabrication of enemies which authorizes the terror of the state and the logical pulsation towards dictatorship. That was point number 5 then. So that's democracy as dictatorship. Number 6, the hegemony of the international financial order. I have probably said enough about this matter already, both today and throughout the course of these lectures, to leave you in no doubt whatsoever regarding the centrality of this component in any realistic assessment of the politics of power in the modern state. However, we should take a moment to identify its profile within the context of the revolutionary template, which is this lecture's particular focus. The appearance in common usage and circulation of paper money in government as well as everyday transactions to replace gold and silver currency is a signal moment in the economic history of any country. When King Louis XVI of France called for the Assembly of the Estates General in 1789, the real crux of the matter was to raise revenues in order to relieve the royal insolvency crisis. In that same year, church properties were nationalized, and the bonds that were issued to facilitate their purchase were the immediate precursor to the assignats, paper instruments, which by 1791 had entered into general circulation as a means of exchange. Dr. Dallas pinpoints the endgame. Napoleon created La Banque de France, and a new upper class began to emerge, later dominating both government and masses. Its instrument of power was the new abstract money, without collateral, the paper assignat, on which the modern world was to be founded. By it, the citizens of the democracy, that system which lay in the ruins of the revolution, were to be transformed into debtors. So that was point number 6, the hegemony of the international financial order. And remember that all of these points are the very template, they're the reflection of modernity as we live and understand it. But each of these points are clearly derived from the original revolutionary template. And I hope that's coming across. So factor number 7 is the ascendancy of the middle classes. In addition to their emergence as the new financial elite just alluded to, it is quite clear that the immediate and principal beneficiaries from the revolutionary upheaval were not the teeming urban and peasant sans-culottes who formed the unruly mobs, but the ambitious, professional, well-heeled and well-connected bourgeoisie, of whom the likes of Robespierre, Danton and Brissot were prominent exemplars. Professor Davies cites the amusing but telling remark of a well-known Jacobin of peasant stock, who said, "I had thought myself in heaven among you, if there were not so many lawyers." The Time of the Bedouin gives us a revealing breakdown of the attendees of a meeting of the Paris deputation to the Estates General in 1789 at the peak of the crisis. Among the 379 electors who turned up, 2 were members of the Academy, there were 5 deputies, 4 bankers, 26 merchants, 154 lawyers, and 13 doctors. Down the social scale, but still relatively prosperous, were 43 retailers and 18 master craftsmen. And furthermore, the aristocracy were torn from power and guillotined en masse. In their place, a new class seized both power and system. Replacing aristocracy came the lawyers. They are certainly the patriarchs of the new ruling elite, as is proven today in both the EU and the USA, where lawyer presidents and prime ministers are the rule, not the exception. So that was point number 7. Number 8 is misogyny. It is not the emergence of feminism in response to the historically institutionalized injustices, inequalities and prejudices of the patriarchal society that is at issue here. Rather, it is the sinister undercurrent of animosity towards feminine humanity which was evident throughout the revolutionary period. Firstly, by the open and ceaseless venting of ferocious and even pornographic attacks by the proto-tabloids of the day against the hated symbol of all things female, Queen Marie Antoinette. Secondly, and more insidiously, there was the effective blotting out of all female distinctiveness under the non-discriminatory appellation of citizen, and whose imprimatur remains visible in the modern political environment as the masculinization of the high-powered politician or businesswoman. Dallas summarizes it as follows. He says, also, at the heart of the rationalist cult is the necessary abolition of women. The tactic, the successful tactic of reason, was to turn them into citizens, and as such, into pseudo-men, or, more precisely, women who would submit to being inside the political system grid. So that was point number 8. Number 9 is the media as a political instrument. We have already alluded to the relentless persecution of Marie Antoinette by journalistic means to the very foot of the scaffold. Of course, we are all more than familiar with the power of today's media corporations, the descendants of the editors and pamphleteers, and their ability to advertise and propagandize, distort perceptions, destroy political careers and personal reputations, and influence public opinion and even the operations of the all-powerful markets. At considerable risk of dangerous overexposure to Clark and Morrison in one form or another, I refer you once again to our reflections on the sorry predicament of the general public with respect to the media. How are we supposed to make sense of the world today? The truth is, we're not. Most of us rely on assorted forms of media to help us, whether large state or corporate outlets, dedicated independent media initiatives, or the blogosphere, whether they be highbrow and academic or lowbrow and populist. However, the inevitable result is the culturally produced ignorance or doubt which has become the subject of a new area of study called agnotology. Since the period just prior to the French Revolution, it has been the established assumption that journalism, backed by experts and academics, will keep us informed so that we can make the kind of intelligent decisions that a modern democracy assumes its citizens will have to make. However, rather than representing the healthy plurality of independent and well-informed voices of democratic freedom, the awful truth is that their conflicting narratives have become a nightmare for us due to their sham independence, egregious bias, and contempt for the grail of objective truth, long sanctified by scientific method. From the word go, we are faced with widely differing and mutually contradictory perspectives extending from the upper reaches of academia to the lower depths of popular journalism. So, we have all ended up in a global culture that claims to be rational while confronting us with a plethora of wildly conflicting viewpoints on every single issue that affects us. To underline the validity of our thesis with respect to this aspect of the revolutionary template, the following observations from the time of the Bedouin will strike a familiar note to the contemporary ear. What was once fought and won by lance, sword, and cannon, in the Revolution was won by the media. It was by pamphlets and the press that victory was assured. The media did not just denounce enemies of the people. It sowed suspicion and unease. Its power was innuendo, distrust, and denunciation by linkage of the innocent to the guilty. And our last point, number 10, is total war. Of all the markers of modern political modalities that we have looked at, as citizens of the 21st century, we must confess to be becoming more and more accustomed to what is perhaps the most viciously uncivilized of them. Total war can be defined as the maximum use for the war effort of all available civilian and military resources, while admitting of little or no distinction at all, when on the offensive, between combatants and non-combatants, or military and civil targets, the destruction of the latter being considered at best collateral damage. There is no doubt that the modern precedent for this strategy occurred during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The National Convention in August 1793 made the following decree: "From this moment until such time as its enemies shall have been driven from the soil of the Republic, all Frenchmen are in permanent requisition for the services of the armies. The young men shall fight. The married men shall forge arms and transport provisions. The women shall make tents and clothes and shall serve in the hospitals. The children shall turn linen into lint. The old men shall betake themselves to the public squares in order to arouse the courage of the warriors and preach hatred of kings and the unity of the Republic." It was the first time that an army of more than 1 million had been mobilized in Western history. So, although it lies beyond the scope of today's lecture with respect to a complete description of the definitive links back to the revolutionary template, I would like to end by returning to the observations of Professor Clarke, which I mentioned at the outset in relation to the question of postmodernism and the condition he describes in terms of mental dehistoricization and presentism as an important new element to add to the complexities of the current picture of the legacy of the French Revolution. He says, "To lose one's memory is not emancipation, but a serious mental disorder. For without memory, we cannot function as ourselves. If a society loses its history, it has the same effect on a larger scale. That society could not have only a disembodied existence. It would have lost all those many things which made it itself. A society which sees itself as unconstrained by the past, undisciplined by duty, by morality, by honour, by custom, by religious aspiration, will therefore be a society with many lawyers and much litigation. That is indeed the society in which we now live." That brings us to the end of today's lecture. I have no specific further reading to recommend and will leave that to your own preference. The subject of our next lecture is the French Revolution Part 4, where we will be looking at the legacy of the French Revolution. For preparatory reading, I would recommend Time of the Bedouin Part 2, Sections 4, pages 263 to 304. Thank you for your attention. Assalamu alaikum.